computer. Okay. So hello, everyone. I believe this is our 15th meeting or something like that of the Society of the Spectacle group. And when we left off yesterday, our last meeting, we had just finished chapter 7, which was the one about geography, territorial management, and so on. And so our next chapter, which we'll read part of this time, is called, chapter 8 is Negation and Consumption Within Culture. And so I think I'll just plunge right in here reading. The epigraph is from a letter from Arnold Ruge to Marx. Ruge was one of Marx's collaborators in 1843, where Marx had not quite developed, his mature analysis, but he was in the radical scene. And Ruge was one of these other people who were maybe a little more eclectic or something like this. So they had a journal of which I think it was only one issue was published. It was called the Deutsch Französisch. It was like the German-French journal. And that had various articles in it, and they decided to put some of their letters in it. So, and it had some stuff by Bakunin in it also, by the way, and so on. So in one of these letters, Marx has been writing to Ruge about kind of revolutionary possibilities, including in Germany. And so here Ruge is responding. Do you really believe that these Germans will make a political revolution in our lifetime? My friend, that is just wishful thinking. Let us judge Germany on the basis of its present history. And surely you are not going to object that all its history is falsified or that all its present public life does not reflect the actual state of the people. Read whatever newspapers you please, and you cannot fail to be convinced that we never stop, and you must concede that the censorship prevents no one from stopping, celebrating the freedom and national happiness that we enjoy, unquote. So, Debord had selected that, and here Debord is in writing in 1969 about May 68, and he quotes that thing that I just read you. Blah, blah, wrote Ruge to Marx in March 1843. 5 years later, that revolution had come in Germany, as well as France and so on. As an amusing example of a type of historical unconsciousness constantly produced by similar causes and always contradicted by similar results, Ruge's unfortunate statement was quoted as an epigraph in the Society of the Spectacle, which appeared December 1967. 6 months later came the occupations movement, the greatest revolutionary moment in France since the Paris Commune. So that's just gives a little idea why he put this thing. You might say, well, what does this have to do with culture? But remember, culture here is being used in a very broad sense of the term. It includes arts, science, media, knowledge, education, religions, the whole bit. So Debord is just picking this of one out of zillions of possible ways in which the cultural sector, in this case, the intelligentsia who are writing to each other, can have drastically ridiculous viewpoints, because there's this kind of disconnect. And here is this sort of comrade of Marx, certainly a friend of his at a certain point, is saying, well, yeah, we'd like to change things in Germany, but, you're just delirious if you're talking about da-da-da. read the newspapers. What do you say? What a thing to say. So now we go into the text itself, number 180. Culture is the general sphere of knowledge and of representations of lived experiences within historical societies, divided into classes. As such, it is a generalizing power which itself exists as a separate entity, as division of intellectual labor and as intellectual labor of division. So there's a division of labor. Some people do one thing, some people do another. But Debord is saying this is a division of intellectual labor. Some people are doing this kind of stuff, and some people. And also, it's an intellectual labor of division. It's a intellectual type of labor, and that type of labor specializes, whether it knows it or not, in dividing. Analyzing, keeping things separate. This is economics. This is politics. This is something, and don't mix them up too much. Culture detached itself from the unity of myth-based society, quote, when human life lost its unifying power and when opposites lost their living connections and interactions and became autonomous, unquote. And that's from an early work by Hegel here. In thus gaining its independence, culture embarked on an imperialistic career of self-enrichment that ultimately led to the decline of that independence. The history that gave rise to the relative autonomy of culture and to the ideological illusions regarding that autonomy is also expressed as the history of culture. And this whole triumphant history of culture can be understood as a progressive revelation of the inadequacy of culture, as a march toward culture's self-abolition. Culture is the terrain of the quest for lost unity. In the course of this quest, culture as a separate sphere is obliged to negate itself. I'm not going to comment on this because the rest of the next few pages is sort of laying out, explaining what he's talking about. In the struggle between tradition and innovation, which is the basic theme of internal cultural development in historical societies, innovation always wins. But cultural innovation is generated by nothing other than the total historical movement, a movement which, in becoming conscious of itself as a whole, tends to go beyond its own cultural presuppositions and toward the suppression of all separations. So that latter thing he's talking about, of course, is the revolutionary movement that is, this is its potential. This is how it operates. This is where it's going, is that once it's been separated out so that you do have some people who specialize in knowledge or in creating art or various other intellectual or superior kind of careers or professions or something like this, then they will look at the society in distorted ways because they're separate from it and they don't completely understand the whole society. But at the same time, their whole rationale for existence is that they are more rational. They can look at the existing society and say, this doesn't make any sense. Those are just myths. Those are superstitions. Yeah, we're starting to see how things really work here. In other words, in general, if you probed what are these cultural things up to, their sort of tendency is toward more rationality. They're finding out more about the world. And that's kind of their thing. They explore, they experiment, they debate, and so on, instead of just saying, oh, forever our forefathers have been telling us that, this myth happens. So that's their tendency. But we will see that if they continue in that tendency, it's towards revolution. It's towards a more broad, insightful view about how society works. But we'll see that there's some other problems they run into. So next thesis, the rapid expansion of society's knowledge, which is undeniable, including the understanding that history is the underlying basis of culture, which people start picking up on, even in ancient Greece, but particularly with Machiavelli and people like that, led to the irreversible self-knowledge reflected by the destruction of God. I mean, this is one way to a shorthand to say that these mythological things, superstitions, religions, or just in general, just kind of seat of the pants guesses about things, tend to, as the clouds dissipate a little bit, people start saying, well, wait a minute. Yeah, you said that the gods made all this, but where's the evidence? We can have other explanations for that. And that ends up, in later times being like people have developed this idea of a supreme God, and that dominates for quite a while. And then people say, wait a minute, no such thing. That's just a fantasy. But this first condition of all critique, that's a quote from Marx, saying Marx said the first condition of criticizing a society is to criticize religion, because if you can't get past the religion, you're not getting very far. That's the most obvious first thing to go. You've got to deal with that. And so Marx and Feuerbach and people like that were already starting to deal with that back in the 1840s and so on. But he's saying, but this first critique of all is also the first task of a critique without end. When there are no longer any tenable rules of conduct, each result of culture pushes culture towards its own dissolution. Like philosophy, the moment it achieved full independence, every discipline that becomes autonomous is bound to collapse. First, as a credible pretension to give a coherent account of the social totality, and ultimately even as a fragmented methodology that might be workable within its own domain. Separate culture's lack of rationality is what dooms it to disappear, because that culture already contains a striving for the victory of the rational. That's what I was just talking about a few minutes ago. There's this tendency toward the rational, even if a lot of irrational, superstitious leftovers may still be mixed in. And so if you get something like science or arts or education or philosophy, whatever, that purports to be separate from and above the society, and to some extent is, I mean, it may also be mixed in with the rulers of the society, etc. But anyway, there's an element of, yes, this is different. Anyway, it's separate. But once you have that separation, then that separation leads to, includes some lack of rationality. Like it sort of has a tendency to learn more things, but sometimes it learns so many things that it can't do anything with them. Or in fact, it learns things that are dangerous for it. Like it learns that, kings don't necessarily come from God. And so some of those things get sort of shunted to the side. You may be a scholar, but you're not supposed to investigate that. You're supposed to investigate something else. Culture grew out of a history that dissolved the previous way of life, but as a separate sphere within a partially historical society, its understanding and sensory communication inevitably remain partial. It is the meaning of an insufficiently meaningful world. The end of the history of culture manifests itself in two opposing forms: the project of culture's self-transcendence within history, which is the sort of good thing, the thing that Marx would be part of, etc. And the other one is its preservation as a dead object for spectacular contemplation. The first tendency has linked its fate to social critique. The second, to the defense of class power. Uh, Each of these two forms of the end of culture has a unitary existence, both within all the aspects of knowledge and within all the aspects of sensory representation, that is, within what was formerly understood as art in the broadest sense of the word. So we have these two things that you get to the end of culture. One is uh, within aspects of knowledge, and the other is within aspects of sensory representation, which could be arts, media, things like that. So in the case of knowledge, so one of those, the accumulation of branches of fragmentary knowledge, which become unusable because approval of existing conditions ultimately requires renouncing one's own knowledge. This thing is opposed by the so that's of this negative thing, that we don't want, is opposed by the theory of praxis, this is like Marx, which alone has access to the truth of all these forms of knowledge, since it alone knows the secret of their use, how to use them. How can you use these things? Okay, so that's for intelligence or knowledge. Second thing, in the case of sensory representations, the critical self-destruction of society's former common language is opposed by its artificial reconstruction within the commodity spectacle, the illusory representation of non-life. So without going into this in detail, in this thesis, we have, going back to the beginning of it, it says each of these two forms, remember we had the two forms were this culture's self-transcendence within a total history. So that's the good holistic kind of thing that sees the whole thing and knows what to do with it. That's the tendency there. That's one side. The other side is the dead side, the negative side, the reactionary side, the preservation of culture as a dead object for spectacular contemplation. And those things are both present in all these cultural things. And then in the last thesis we just read, uh, each of these two things, these two divisions, plays out in these two domains. One, the domain of knowledge, and the other domain of sensory representation, like art and so on. So, next one. I'm going to keep going here because I think each one explains a little bit what came before. And then when we get down here, to the next three of these things, we'll be able to look back and have a little discussion about what does this mean. Once society has lost its myth-based community, and we remember that the myth-based community, okay, it's mythical, it's superstitious, all that kind of thing, but it did tend to be a sort of real unity. People were directly living in groups with other people that they knew, and they were close to nature and all that kind of thing. So if you lose that myth-based community, it loses all the reference points of a truly common language. Those Bushmen had a common language, say, until such time as the divisions within the inactive community can be overcome by the inauguration of a real historical community. So it's not like we're going back to the Bushman type of thing or something like that, but we can appreciate that had certain qualities. and certain limitations. So if they lose that kind of thing and suddenly they're throwing out like, well, what's the universe? What's going on here? I'm lost. He's talking about that uh, that it loses a common language. So people can't talk with each other. They don't have a basic thing they can refer to, and everybody understands what they're talking about. Like when you were talking about God or something like that. Uh, when art, which was the common language of social inaction, develops into independent art in the modern sense, emerging from its original religious universe and becoming individual production of separate works, it too becomes subject to the movement governing the history of all separate culture. Its declaration of independence is the beginning of its end. Now, again, we know, I think in various ways, you're aware that primitive art or ancient art, even medieval art and so on like that, had a kind of communal character. It was usually connected with religious or mythical or, you know, things like that. And you didn't usually see, hey, I am so and so. I created this original, work here. I mean, you never hear when we went through those primitive songs in our other Zoom group. Uh, it was very rare that you even knew who wrote a song. And that would be only in the case of somebody in the 20th century or something. Nobody was saying, "Hey, I've created this new song. Isn't this snazzy? It's innovative. You've never seen anything like that." They didn't, if they did songs, they were supposed to be not supposed to be unexpected. They weren't supposed to be like the first person ever to use this verse in this kind of way or to use a new method of narration. They all did the same stuff. They told the same stories in roughly the same styles with the same mythological background and so on. And if they were architects to build, they built churches or they built statues or stuff like that that were part of the group's thing. They were just, like another person in the group, nothing special. And so as we get through, maybe late medieval and so on, and get to, say, the Renaissance and stuff like this, you start getting individual people who take pride in being an innovative, independent, original artist of some sort. Yeah, and you had some of this in ancient Greece and Rome, of course, already. But um, anyway, when that happens, um, when it develops into independent art in the modern sense, which like in the Renaissance would be, for example, emerging from its original universe and becoming individual production of separate works. Here's a painting. Do you want to buy it? Or do you want to finance me and you can put it in your church or on your wall, whatever. Uh, uh, it too, art, when it does that, it too becomes subject to the movement governing the history of all separate culture, which is what we've just been talking about, how when you're in that mode, that stuff disintegrates. It contains conflicts. You know, it you've it's declared its independence. Like I am an artist. I'm not just an ordinary, worldly guy here. I'm somebody who creates. I'm kind of like God. God created stuff. I'm creating something. This is insightful. It's impressive. It has various things that people can use it for entertainment or for religious uses, depending on what it was. Once you get in that mode where the artist is different, then just like the scientist or the theologian or the philosopher or something like that is separate from the society, if the artist is separate from the society, there end up being some contradictions. Like, what is the role of an artist? Well, we think of the role of an artist. The old role was like what we're talking about, religious things, and it wasn't very creative necessarily. But we think of the artist being creative is they're creating a work, and this work has some, well, what would be its uses? For example, like, is it to entertain people? Or is there, I mean, is it something more? I mean, we say the ancient Greek tragedies did entertain people, but they were also kind of quasi-religious. I mean, they were considered like serious stuff, even though it wasn't quite like a religious thing. It was getting there. So you have these different things like, what is this for? Well, suppose the purpose of art is, as Aristotle said, is to imitate nature in some way. You represent some story or some thing or some person or something like that. Well, now what happens if you represent something about the society that you're in? Like, imagine in ancient Greece if there had been a novel, somebody writing about the life of the slave. You can be sure, first of all, that probably most people of that time would have said, "What the fuck?" I mean, it would have never been read or something, but if people did read it, the masters of the slaves would not have liked that you were giving a sympathetic image of the slave being oppressed or something. This is just a crude example. Like, the artist, in order to get along back then, had to either sell the art, which was rare, or have a patron. And the patrons were uh, tended to be like kings, nobles, rich people, or something, who would take pride in financing this statue, which was then put in blah, blah, blah. So you can see already that you would have contradictions there, like some art wouldn't fly. And so because it was so obviously wouldn't fly, nobody would even do it. Or if anybody ever did it, it didn't survive. It was just some madman, writing some stuff, and nobody thought to make copies of it. So, uh, so its declaration of independence is the beginning of its end. If it really goes that direction, more and more independent, and there can be a temptation to do that because you can think, hey, I'm like a god, I'm a demigod, I'm creating all this stuff. Or maybe some artists, like the Michelangelos or this or that, will get so much support from the popes or the kings or whoever it is that it does become like becoming a rock star or something. You become very well paid to do these things as long as they don't irk the rulers. If they irk the rulers in some way, then you will stop getting commissions, if not getting arrested or or whatever. So, next thesis, the positive significance of the modern decomposition and formal destruction of all art. Maybe I'll jump ahead here. Remember that the Situationists, if you remember from back when we dealt with the anthology, they're going through all this stuff about modern art, like Dadaism, Surrealism, Cubism, various currents, futurism, uh, that were sort of already, even in the 19th century, were already coming up with these new things that were very independent. I mean, people like Flaubert and Mallarmé, I mean, they didn't give a shit for society, really. I mean, for them, art was the thing, and society, well, they had to deal with it just to kind of get by. But they weren't kowtowing to that. They had this ideal, like this will be the ultimate poem, or this will be the perfect novel that's so objective and so this or that. So Debord and the Situationists looking back on that, we're saying there were these tendencies during the past century and a half or so, and since Romanticism was already kind of a volatile innovation. And when you get to the modern art, it really starts going crazy. You have paintings that don't look like anything, and painters who are intentionally making a painting not look realistic, etc. So this is this formal destruction of art that is the language of communication has been lost. So that's the positive significance of this, is that the language of communication has been lost. The negative implication of this development, this decomposition, is that a common language can no longer take the form of the unilateral conclusions that characterized the art of historical societies. I'm going to stop there. So, if you go back and look at the art of historical societies, say the Renaissance, Baroque, even Middle Ages, societies that are on the move, so to a certain extent, even in ancient Greece and Rome, etc., for example, you perceive, and so now I'm going to continue the sentence. He's saying the unilateral conclusions that characterize the art of historical societies, and he defines it here, belated portrayals of someone else's dialogueless life, which accepted this lack as inevitable. So if you think about it, it's like a typical work of art, let's say an 18th century novel, is a picture of life, uh, but it's not your life, uh, and it's not now. It's like 50 years ago or 10 years ago or centuries ago, this happened. It didn't happen to you, it happened to somebody else. The somebody else may be a complete fiction, or it can be a historical character who's been fictionalized or something. But it's a story about these things that a person in the 18th century reads, like they read Shakespeare talking about something in the 15th century. Or they read a novel about, whatever. They're reading about somebody else's life. And that life itself, he says, is dialogueless. So this might sound a little bit, what does that mean? Because there's dialogue in these novels and so on. But what Debord is saying is that you're you're receiving a picture of something where even though a bunch of stuff is happening, it's not really, it's just a play. Uh, it's ultimately it's not much there. Or if it is there, in any case, you come back to the fact it's not you and it's not real and it's not the present. So that was like a typical art thing, is that you've got a portrait of somebody in the past and it's preserved for the present, but it's preserved in a kind of frozen mode. So the negative is that the common language can no longer take that form of that kind of stuff, but it must now be found in a praxis, which is practice and theory together. A praxis that unifies direct activity with its own appropriate language. Direct activity is what you do, what I do, what we do, what people now do, or that we can talk with or envisage. And not only do we do it, we think about it. We experiment, we look at it, we draw conclusions from failures, change tactics, etc., like that. So he's saying the common language can no longer take the form of these old things like art, which used to be the common language, this kind of passive language that everybody would have looked at. Now it has to take the form of a praxis that unifies direct activity with its own appropriate language. Remains to be seen what that language will be, but it's not going to be the old art language, because that's So here, now he sums up, as he does in so many places in this book, the point is to actually participate in the community of dialogue and the game with time that up till now have merely been represented by poetic and artistic works. So it's not saying there's something, that these poetic and artistic works are valueless or didn't have some significance, but it was that they had this element of separation from people. They weren't part of an active dialogue, part of an active action that talked with each other about what are we going to do? Let's do this together. So he summed that up beautifully in one little sentence there. And so one final thing here, and then we'll stop and talk. When art becomes independent and paints its world in dazzling colors, a moment of life has grown old. Such a moment cannot be rejuvenated by dazzling colors. It can only be evoked in memory. The greatness of art only emerges at the dusk of life. So when you do have this vivid art, the very vividness is a reflection that life isn't like that. This is what comes at the end. So I'm going to stop there. And we've had 3 pages of stuff here, a lot to talk about. So please, comments and questions. Yes, Mike, unmute yourself.
I'm struck by his use of the dialectic in the unity of opposites, the art and as a separate thing, and daily life as something else. Um, and the as dialectic goes, when you have those things in conflict, eventually you have an Aufhebung or a sublation of the two. And what happens is then is that you have something new which contains the part of the old and negates a lot of what went before. So that's where you get this strange phrase, the negation of the negation. So anyway, he's using this quite well, and I think what he's trying to get at, if I might be so bold, is when art sort of undergoes this Aufhebung. It we as a society start creating, and just art becomes life becomes kind of us working, doing what we're doing in our everyday lives. So I didn't notice anybody else raising their hand, so I just thought I would say
Yeah,
that.
no problem. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Ed Matthews, unmute yourself.
Okay, you can hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
These 3 pages are so full of wonderful ideas and observations. As I was reading through this second or third time, I forget, I was thinking of the work I had done looking at ancient Greece and how many of these ideas reflect that era where in the 1200s, with the Dark Ages, the language disappears. So modes of communication are there, people speaking, but there is no written language. There's no graphic language. And it takes several years, several hundred years for it to come back. But people still think and they continue to converse. And when the language finally gets written down, following the kind of Phoenician alphabet, it's like these thinkers hit the ground running and off they go with their competing ideas about the nature of the universe and cosmology and so on. But in that new world where language has been, in a sense, rediscovered, the Greeks were able to look at mythology and essentially take that religious component of society, set it aside, and where you would have normally had a temple, you now had this thing called the agora, right? The agora, which was partly the meeting place for people to exchange ideas and show each other's their work, and it became a marketplace later on. But what's remarkable is the theological or mythical dimension of life just gets set off to one side. And the idea of philosophy as early as that time is there as an instructive tool. And although from that point on, we go through the Dark Ages and we finally come out the other side in the 1600s, the Renaissance and so on, then we get to Hegel, who, when I looked up the section from the difference between Fichte and Schelling, what Hegel was talking about here in relation to this quote was actually philosophy. So it's still part of culture, but the notion that when human life loses its unifying power and when opposites lose their living connection and interaction and become autonomous, that apparently for Hegel is when philosophy kicks in. But philosophy is still one of those aspects of culture, obviously writ large, education and technology and so on. So I just found these passages remarkable. And of course, he concludes the chapter with clear strategies, right? The notion that our ideas about praxis kind of get subsumed into art. We're busy making art and not revolting. I think it was Godard said years ago in the 60s, if you want to stop a revolutionary from being a revolutionary, hand him a camera. And they start filming ideas about the revolution. He was being facetious, but the point that Debord is getting at is there was this energy expended in the creation of art, when in fact perhaps we should be thinking more critically about why we want to make this piece of art. Perhaps we can take it down to the level of the street and say, maybe we can just change our world rather than painting representations about it. So to actively involve ourselves. And of course, it gets to this in section 85, 86, and 87. And I'm writing on the side, critical praxis subsumed into the art object. And then later, language is lost in the dissolution of art. It now becomes reified. And these codes that people sort of look up in aesthetic contemplation of art, nothing changes, right? It becomes subsumed in the representation of something rather than us using that creative and critical praxis and applying it to our life. So one of my favorite chapters in the book.
Good. Yeah. I'm just going to proceed here.
Can I ask something?
Yes, please do.
I don't understand the greatness of art only emerges at the dusk of life. It seems to me that art is sort of separate. I mean, if there's a great painting of, a garden or a whatever, it's on its own. It's actually, life is like that. The garden is beautiful, whether you look at a garden or whether you look at a painting of a garden. So I don't know. And it seems like there's always been an impulse in human beings to create art, and maybe that got perverted by the selling of art and all that and the individualization of it, but it's an impulse human beings have.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
So he seems like he's sort of dissing it. And don't you think maybe he's taking on a little too much? I mean, why does he have to drag art into this whole thing?
Well, because there is art and art. Debord, Debord and Oscar Jorn and these people, their whole thing is to make life creative. So, I mean, in no way are they dissing creativity. If you want to call it dissing, which is not really the appropriate term, I don't think, they're pointing out the limits. It's like if there was a really good cook and the cook cooked up some great dishes and then put them on a platform for people to look at. We would say, well, yeah, creative. He's just thinking about recipes all the time and trying different stuff. And but we were so, well, wait a minute, what is, how about eating it? Oh, no, 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 this is a special thing. And this is kind of maybe a silly exaggeration, but the point is that of course people are going to be doing creative things. And in fact, in the society we live in, 99% of people's creativity is crushed. So it's not, doesn't make any sense to say, oh, he's talking about a society where such creativity as there is in most people is zero. And even with the artists, he's saying these people are like, uh, like prostitutes, really. They're specialists. They're like a sports store or something like that. For one reason or another, they can do something pretty good or catchy or something that people say, oh, that's flash. I like those colors, or I like this. And they become perhaps rich or famous for this. And 99.9% of people don't get to do any creativity. And if they did, I mean, it would be a joke because they wouldn't even know, they've lost the habit of creativity. So an artist or art is the terrain, the domain where it's still possible to be creative. I mean, if you think of the vast number of jobs that people have, there's very little room for any creativity. Quite the contrary. If you're a teacher, they don't want you to be creative. They want you to teach the things so that they'll pass these tests, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in the arts, exceptionally, you can have somebody who's a completely eccentric character who doesn't give us, and people even laugh at that and say, oh, that old Van Gogh, what a character. He cuts off his ear, he goes crazy, but wow, look at those starry nights and da da da. We're used to kind of accepting that as this weird thing. Like, oh, that's the prerogative of these creative people, the artists. They can create stuff and just on a whim. They can wake up and say, oh, I dreamed of something, and now I'm going to paint the dream. I'm going to write a poem about my dream. All this. So they get to do that. Like the Beatles get to sing in front of, a million people. Nobody else does, or very few other people do. And so everything is focused on those things. And it may be that the Beatles or these other artists are doing fun, beautiful, interesting things. Sometimes they are. But the point is that the society in which that is happening is not, they're part of the little, they're painting a prison. It's like they're decorating the bars. Oh, well, that makes things a bit more pleasant. Look at that. That's very interesting. They're not breaking down the walls. And uh, so I think enough of that. Ed Matthews?
Yeah, to Judy's point, I just wanted to point out that in this book here, Potlatch, which is the kind of missives and newsletters that Debord had worked on when he was a Letterist International, this collection that came out in 1985, Debord wrote a very short little kind of introduction to it. So he writes, the judgment of Potlatch regarding the end of art, he's writing this in French, of course, the judgment of Potlatch regarding the end of art or modern art seemed to be, at the beginning of 1954, rather excessive. And he says, since then, we have never been able to find a single artist who will be willing to resolve or to basically stop making art. But then he ends it. On the other hand, we haven't been able to find someone that was also able to come up with a central critique of our society like we have. So on the one hand, yes, artists will continue to create. I mean, no matter what few things they have to play with, but they're also not concerned with a central critique of society that they were. So there's, in a sense, kind of saying room for both. But there is that perhaps a lost potential in art to be critical, to be
Yeah.
self-reflexive. And
Yeah.
of course, at the end of the chapter, he talks about détournement, which is, again, sort of the solution.
Yeah. Yeah, you can say that for Debord, I mean, Debord loved Baudelaire and Stendhal and various these. I mean, maybe not loved, but he read them very carefully, and all this. But that was because he could see in their time, when they said a certain thing, it had a certain pertinence. And you can draw on that now, not just imitating it, but you can maybe take a sentence from Stendhal and change it, deturn it a little bit, and you can use it. Whereas most modern art, when you look at their things, somebody like Debord would say, this is not serious. This is just a blah, blah. You know, I mean, it might sound impressive to people that don't know what's going on, but, you know, it would. So anyway, this next thesis I'm going to read is one of the longest ones in the book, and it's about the Baroque. And it's interesting, you know, like you might not expect, why would he deal about the Baroque? But he has a lot of interesting things to say about it. And the reason that he finds that is so significant, I mean, he describes why is this, is that the Baroque came at a period after the Renaissance, but sort of before Romanticism. And, you know, it's in this area here where society is also doing a lot of funny things. It's leading up to the French Revolution. It's already seen the English Revolution at a little distance, maybe. And part of its thing is, when we say Baroque art, what is the Baroque art? And he emphasizes its festivals and drama, not drama just as a play, but, you know, it's like a party. It's no longer a mass, and it's no longer just individual blah, blah, blah. It's an ensemble thing, although the ensemble thing might be just an ensemble from the standpoint of King Louis XIV or something. You know, it's like you have a series of paintings going around that with, you know, paintings on the ceilings and, you know, all these elaborate kind of things. But he's taking the Baroque as a sort of forerunner or image of how modern society, the modern spectacle, is bringing everything together, but it's bringing them together in a sort of fake form. But he refers to this book, which is not translated in English, unfortunately. This is the French version. It's called On the Baroque by Eugenio d'Ors, who is a Catalan writer and a reactionary, by the way, not radical in any sense. But he wrote this book that is an interesting study of what is the Baroque and how to, sort of taking a global view and relating to, I believe I remember that he took Romanticism as being a subset of the Baroque. You know, like the Baroque was sort of this tendency to go beyond, you know, a sort of center classical thing. So it's the first thing that sort of spreads out and purports to be a whole world. So here's what he says about the Baroque. The historical time that invaded art was manifested first of all in the sphere of art itself, beginning with the Baroque. Baroque was the art of a world that had lost its center with the collapse of the last mythical order, namely the medieval synthesis of a unified Christianity with the ghost of an empire which had harmonized heavenly and earthly government. So you no longer have that. You sort of had that at the beginning of the Renaissance, but it was already being challenged. So the art of change, you never before had an art of change. If you think back, medieval things aren't talking about how life is changing, and neither were ancient. So the art of change inevitably embodied the same ephemerality that it discovered in the world. As Eugenio d'Ors put it, it chose, quote, life as opposed to eternity, unquote. The outstanding achievements of Baroque were in theater and festival, or in theatrical festivals. where the sole purpose of each particular artistic expression was to contribute to the composition of a scene which itself had to serve as its own center of unification, because you've lost this general center like God or the Pope or the King or something. A scene which had to serve as its own center of unification, and that center was passage or transitoriness or something, the expression of a threatened equilibrium within the overall dynamic disorder. So all this stuff is going on. I always, when I read this, I think of some of these fancy ceilings that you see, you know, where you're in these big palaces or whatever, and you look up at the ceiling and it imitates like it would be to look up at the sky, and you're seeing angels and gods and birds flying and flying horses, you know, with Greek heroes on them and all this stuff. And it's like and it tapers down to the walls. So it's like you're in a light show or something. Yeah, you know, yeah, you're surrounded by this. You can't possibly focus on any one thing, but there is a unity there. And the unity is a unity of a life that is fluctuating, moving, all kinds of stuff is going on. The somewhat excessive emphasis on the concept of Baroque in contemporary aesthetic discussions reflects the awareness that an artistic classicism is no longer possible. That would be like where you can really say, here's how it is, like a Greek statue or, you know, something like that. The attempts to establish a normative classicism or neoclassicism during the last 3 centuries have been nothing but short-lived artificial constructs, speaking the official language of the state, whether of the absolute monarchy, like Louis XIV, or of the revolutionary bourgeoisie draped in Roman togas, like the French Revolution. In each case, you may remember if you look at at French Revolution art, you know, for this very brief period, it's got they're all in togas and it looks like ancient Rome, sort of, but it's not really, you know, it's just a silly effort to make it look like ancient Rome. It isn't like ancient Rome. This is a wholly different kind of people and society. What eventually followed Baroque, once it had run its course over a century or two, was an ever more individualistic art of negation, which, from Romanticism to Cubism, continually renewed its assaults until it had fragmented and destroyed the entire artistic sphere. And that will be with Dadaism, etc. The disappearance of historical art, which was linked to the internal communication of an elite, and which had its semi-independent social basis in the partially playful conditions still experienced by the last aristocracies, also reflects the fact that capitalism produced the first form of class power that acknowledges its own total lack of ontological quality. Modern capitalism, after all these other things, as fake as they were, you know, there was something there. You had the medieval churches, you had the dramatic knights and shining armor of the fantasies of the aristocracy and these various things. And then you get to the French Revolution and after, and the heroes are lawyers and politicians, businessmen, merchants. Yeah, you know, I mean, there's there's no quality there except, oh, is he good at making money? A power whose basis is in the mere management of the economy. All that reflects the loss of all human mastery. Remember, with the aristocracy and etc., you had some semblance of mastery, you know, of either that a master himself was had special qualities, or that even, if only that individuals might be the masters of an art, or something like this. And he's saying the comprehensive unity of the Baroque ensemble, which has long been lacking in the world of artistic creation, we haven't seen that, has in a sense been revived in today's wholesale consumption of the totality of past art. So again, Debord is so good at these, making these giant leaps. He's talking about the Baroque and it's this sort of tendency and all this, and then it fades out and it leads to these other things. And so he's saying that Baroque, do we have a modern Baroque? No. The modern artists are incapable of that. They're not even trying to do that. They wouldn't know what it was about. And even if they did it, it would receive no welcome. People wouldn't know, what are you trying to do? But he's saying there is an analogy there, and it's a dead analogy. It's the analogy of the fact that now we can look at all from our universal world vantage point. We can look back at all the past art of all the civilizations and cultures that have ever existed, and we can put some of them in our museums, and have books about them, reproducing them, make videos about them, all this. We've got all this as a consumption of the totality of past art. So in a sense, we're doing a Baroque thing passively. As all the art of the past comes to be recognized and appreciated historically, which of course we all do when we go to a museum or something, and is retrospectively reclassified as a phrase of a single world art, so-called, which it never was, but now we look back, oh, that's world art, isn't it? It has all these different variations here, but it's art of the world, and we're all in one world. It is incorporated into a global disorder, the world we live in, that can be seen, that can itself be seen as a sort of Baroque structure at a higher level, a structure that absorbs Baroque art itself along with all its possible revivals. For the first time in history, the arts of all ages and civilizations can be known and accepted together. And the fact that it has become possible to collect and recollect all these art historical memories marks the end of the world of art. It's only because it's dead that we can do this. In this age of museums, in which artistic communication is no longer possible, all the previous expressions of art can be accepted equally, because whatever particular communication problems they may have had are eclipsed by the present day obstacles to communication in general. So there's a big, he's come through all this Baroque thing to come back to our whole big society of the spectacle. I'm going to continue here for a little bit. Art in its period of dissolution, which is where we are now, or say 20th century, a movement of negation striving for its own transcendence within a historical society where history is not yet directly lived, so there's a contradiction there, is at once an art of change and the purest expression of the impossibility of change. The more grandiose its pretensions, we're talking about arts here, the further from its grasp is its true fulfillment. This art is necessarily avant-garde, and at the same time, it does not actually exist. Its vanguard is its own disappearance. And now the next one will kind of clarify, what does that mean? Dadaism and Surrealism were the two currents that marked the end of modern art. Though they were only partially conscious of it, they were contemporaries of the last great offensive of the revolutionary proletarian movement. and the defeat of that movement, which led them trapped within the very artistic sphere whose decrepitude they had denounced, was the fundamental reason for their immobilization. Now remember, each of these, Dadaism and Surrealism, both were explicitly revolutionary. They explicitly wanted to change the world. They explicitly looked at the whole world as a totality, said this whole thing is bullshit. We want something different. Something different is possible. No compromise with all the, they're looking at World War I would be a classic example of the utter ridiculousness and vulgarity and viciousness of the, absurdity of the old world. This whole war about nothing, basically, except a little bit of a competition over colonies. And tens of millions of people die. So that's where Dadaism, Surrealism both said explicitly, we want to change the world. They didn't say, we want to found a new art movement. Okay, so, but there were other things that were trying to change the world then, like the German Revolution following World War I, or the Russian Revolution up to a certain extent, and in Italy, and so on. And those things failed. And so by the 20s, when these two movements look around and like, hey, what's happening? Like those movements could have been allied. And it's not abstract. It's not a fantasy to say they could have been allied, because some of the Dadaists were on the front lines of the Spartacus revolt in 1918 in Germany, for example. And I mean, many of these people were conscious, that this was a whole trip. It was not an artistic trip. Okay, so Dadaism and Surrealism were historically linked, yet also opposed to each other. This opposition involved the most important and radical contributions of the two movements, but it also revealed the internal inadequacy of their one-sided critiques. Dadaism sought to abolish art without realizing it, without fulfilling it. Surrealism sought to realize art, fulfill art, without abolishing it. The critical position since developed by the Situationists has shown that the abolition and realization of art are inseparable aspects of a single transcendence of art, or you could say supersession of art. So that's the idea there. It's that. Dadaism basically adopted a purely negative thing vis-a-vis art as well as everything else. The so-called art that they made, you wouldn't really call it art, it's just they're doing zany spectacles and coming up with poems that were nothing but gibberish and et cetera, et cetera. The main thing there was negative. And after a few years of that, you had the French Dadaists, included André Breton and Aragon and Supol and people like that. They had gone along, okay, we're in Dadaism. And then by the early 20s, Breton and some of the others are thinking, this thing is too purely negative. I mean, that had its place, but we're looking for something positive here. And they found some positive things like, oh, we've had Freud, psychoanalysis, the unconscious, all this, and then that can kind of tie in with Rimbaud and Gerard de Nerval and Lautréamont and, various things like this. And so they would try doing automatic writing, they were looking at painting and all these things, and they ended up creating a lot of art. But when asked about this, I mean, Breton himself, who was the theorist of the movement, he would say, well, he would kind of fudge on it. He would say, well, we want to realize poetry, if necessary, even without poems. So, in other words, we're writing poems, we're painting pictures because we think that will be provocative, you know, blah, blah, blah. But our point is to change the world. And if there was some better way to do it, we'd do it and forget the poems on paper. And so later, when Debord and the Situationists are looking back on that in the early 60s, they kind of take off on that and said, in contrast to this thing that Breton said about our position is realizing poetry necessarily without poems. So they're saying, yeah, you know, you can write poems if you want, but that has nothing to do with what we're talking about. Nothing. You know, we're talking about the poetry of everyday life, the poetry of people's individual lives, of people working together to do things like that. And in the present context, if somebody comes in and says, I want to have a poem I'd like to read here or something, Debord is saying, again, maybe hyperbolically, but he's saying, look, that has nothing to do with what we're talking about. Maybe a century ago, that might have had some credibility. It doesn't now. We're in the middle. And anyway, this is where that last sentence is that, and by the way, this is the only time the word situationist is used in this book. And later on, Debord mentions that fact. He said, I did that very specifically. I didn't want this to be seen as a situationist book. I mean, loosely, of course, we can consider it a situationist, but he wanted this to be not something promoting situationism, something. And so he only brought it in here in the one perfectly appropriate place, because this is one place where historically you have to. Anybody writing the history of any of this stuff the century from now, if you say what was, you know, let's have a very abbreviated history, just you have surrealism, you have you would have to say the situationists came in here and said you have to both realize and abolish art. That's a kind of way of summing up the first part of their history, you know, late 50s, early 60s is, and so legitimately he can put the situationists in there on a par with the Dadaists and Surrealists simply on the art thing by saying these were the big two currents of marked the end of modern art, and then the situationists come in and clarify it yet further by saying each of these two things was limited. We came up with this thing, which is a one-sentence way of summarizing 10 years of work, 10 years of experimentation, and so on. So, let's see here. Any comments and questions about these last things here? Baroque, and end of art, Dadaism, Surrealism. Ed Matthews, you're already here. Okay.
Yeah, just one quick comment on the sections 89 to 91. One thing that's not stated explicitly, but I think is a thread that runs through all of these comments on art, is how Debord starts with the Baroque period, which, as far as we know, is one of the very first historically conscious eras in world history. The Baroque knew they were on the precipice of something new, something had finished behind them, and were self-conscious of their historical position. Now, if you look elsewhere in philosophy, there is the notion that the first modern subject begins around the same time, when someone decides that perhaps they don't need the intermediary of a priest or the clergy to speak directly to God. That becomes a radical move. So what I'm getting at here is an increasingly radical subjectivity, which begins in the Baroque, works its way through the Romantic period. What is that? Everybody lights out to further territory, like Mark Twain, rejects industrialization rejects that particular society, decides to live on their own. And as we move through each of these, we get to data and surrealism, a complete negation or rejection of technological advancements at the expense of human progress. So again, another negation which is very subjective. But what I like is this kind of increasingly radical subject. But he ends that section still by saying that, yes, we need to transcend art. And in 190, he's talking about how the avant-garde does not really actually exist, because he seems to be kind of posing the rhetorical question, what is avant-garde actually, preparing, and what is it trying to advance? It kind of exists in a kind of ahistorical moment, and the avant-garde needs to be backed up with something that is going to move it to the next step. So to make avant-garde art, you need to make sure that you are now advancing this new idea. And it just seems to kind of exhaust itself in its very production, which again is subsuming praxis, critical commentary, critical reflection, because you're busy making art. So I just wanted to mention that, but that radical subjectivity, I think, is a thread that ties all these different sections together.
Thank you. I'm just going to continue. Looking ahead, we have, we can't possibly finish this here, but I think that we can come close to getting halfway through this chapter. So we have this chapter, and then there's one very short chapter at the end. So I think what our next meeting will be maybe finishing this chapter, but coming pretty close. And the meeting after that will be the last chapter, and maybe a little extra if we didn't finish this meeting. If we've gotten through this, the last chapter is just 4 pages. We may, at that point, we can just have a conversation about the whole book as we look back. And then I was thinking that we might, we would just have time in the remainder of the year for maybe 2 more meetings, depending on how my schedule works in December, all that, which would be time to see Debord's last film in Girum, which we could do similarly to how we did the film of Society of the Spectacle, in 2 parts. It's a little bit longer film, but anyway, I think that might be a nice way to round this off, and then I can think about whether I'm going to do any further thing on this. Anyway, I'd like to get a little bit farther in this chapter in any case. Number 192, the spectacular consumption that preserves past culture in congealed form, including co-opted rehashes of its negative manifestations. Now that might be like somebody comes up with a neo-Dadaist thing, and the Situationists were saying that stuff is all over the place. Just the Dadaists did it when it was original, just because you can go out and let's say break your guitar in the middle of a concert or something like that. That's already been done. Come on, this is not anything creative, including these things. This spectacular consumption gives overt expression in its cultural sector to what it implicitly is in its totality, namely the communication of the incommunicable. The most extreme destruction of language can be officially welcomed as a positive development, because it amounts to yet one more way of flaunting one's acceptance of a status quo where all communication has been smugly declared absent. I think of people like Andy Warhol or something like that, but I mean, there's all sorts of different expressions of this sort of thing, like where people think it's very avant-garde to declare that you're making something out of nothing, or that you don't give a shit or something. Wow, he's radical, So the critical truth of this destruction, the real life of modern poetry and art, what's really going on underneath, is obviously concealed, since the spectacle, whose function is to use culture to bury all historical memory, applies its own essential strategy in its promotion of modernistic pseudo-innovations. It doesn't mean, again, this isn't like somebody is plotting this, like, hey, let's start a movement that will do this. Occasionally that's true. Maybe the CIA does something, or, when the Beatles are popular, somebody actually sits down and says, will we do an imitation Beatles? And they create the monkeys by putting ads in a paper, but usually it's not that conscious. It's just that what he's saying is that various people are going to be doing various artistic experiments, ventures, trying to write the great American novel or trying to be this or that. And the system will tend to accept the ones that he's talking about there. And namely, if somebody comes up with some sort of innocuous thing that's kind of cute, it'll be accepted. If somebody comes up with something that really has an edge of criticality, it usually won't be accepted, or, etc. So, applies its own essential strategy in its promotion of modernistic pseudo-innovations. Thus, a school of neo-literature, I think he's talking about the Oulipo thing here, but it could be something else, that baldly admits that it does nothing but contemplate the written word for its own sake, which by definition is just sort of a stupid, at best, it's just a game like playing crossword puzzles or something. So anyway, something that can pass itself off as something new. Oh my gosh, he wrote a novel without using the letter E. So meanwhile, alongside the simple claim that the death of communication has a sufficient beauty of its own, so we can, again, think of all the noir things, that, oh, it's bleak, everybody's out for himself, people aren't communicating, uh, all that. And then you make something kind of beautiful or supposedly beautiful. It's kind of a lyrical thing, even though it's depressing or something. Um, uh, the most modern tendency of spectacular culture, which is also the one most closely linked to the repressive practice of the general organization of society, seeks by means of collective projects to construct complex neo-artistic environments out of decomposed elements, as can be seen in urbanism's attempts to incorporate scraps of art or hybrid aesthetico-technical forms. We can think of various famous artists that will do these projects that have little, if any, apparent meaning. This is an expression in the domain of spectacular pseudo-culture of advanced capitalism's general project of remolding the fragmented worker into a, quote, socially integrated personality, unquote. A tendency that has been described by recent American sociologists, Reisman, White, etc. They're the people, Reisman wrote I forget their books, but these are sociologists of the 50s who revealed, he'll talk about these a little bit later, who revealed a lot of stuff about the society, but in a sort of limited way. In all these areas, the goal remains the same: to restructure society without community. Think about when new building projects are proposed and what ends up getting done. So often, sometimes there's exceptions. Somebody makes a nice building or a nice little park or something like that. But in general, you often have the feeling like, oh, we used to have a lively little square here, like with a lot of little cafes and people talking on the street corners. And in the name of community, somebody ripped through that and put up a pillar that was called Community Play Center or something, you know, where people are supposed to come together and have a good time. And it's just sterile, and nobody would be inspired to do anything there. Whereas some sort of accidentally picturesque little place, even if it's much less, you know, expensive and dramatic and modern, might, you know, people might have a whole tradition of coming and hanging out there, you know, and jamming or, you know, whatever. Um, so, next one is culture, and this is us Berkeley people will have a special savor for this. If you remember in the free speech movement of 1964, one of the general complaints of the students, I mean, one of them was that we weren't given free speech. We couldn't have a civil rights table on campus or this or that. But there was also a sort of more general thing, like this big university is just treating everybody as numbers. You know, we feel like we're in a factory. You know, it may have a kind of pretty campus or something, although it's getting overbuilt, you know, and it's by the bay, so that's nice. But when you look at it, all the tendencies of the university is to keep building more buildings and to attract more students. And then the students, you know, there gets to be like 25 or 30,000 students. I mean, it is like a huge factory where no, you know, relatively few people know each other. And so the president of the University of California at that time was Clark Kerr. And he had written, as a coincidence, in 1963, a thing called The Idea of the University. He was a very literate guy, and he wrote, What's the function of the university? And he was the one who called the university a knowledge factory, and he wasn't criticizing it. He was saying, we're cranking out knowledge here, folks, you know, like nobody's business. You know, that's the function of a university. And we're doing it so much better than they used to. And so here, Debord quotes him, as culture becomes completely commodified, it tends to become the star commodity of spectacular society. Clark Kerr, one of the foremost ideologues of this tendency, has calculated that the complex process of the production, distribution, and consumption of knowledge already accounts for 29% of the gross national product of the United States, 1963. And he predicts that in the second half of this century, culture will become the driving force of the American economy, as was the automobile in the first half of this century and the railroad in the last half of the previous century. And that, he said exactly that. And I mean, it's a beautiful thing that Debord, again, can pick this thing. I mean, obviously, the reason he knew about it was that the free speech movement had come in 1964, a year after he wrote that book. And so they were, of course, in their debates and polemics and all that, they were quote, hey, here's what President Kerr says about the university. He says we're a knowledge factory and blah, blah, blah. And so that was translated into French, or, you know, Debord found out about it with, you know, in 1965. Otherwise, he would have never heard of Clark Kerr, but he knew about it because they had called that to his attention, so to speak. And so let's see. I'll read one more and then we'll pause again. The task of the various branches of knowledge that are in the process of developing spectacular thought is to justify an unjustifiable society and to establish a general science of false consciousness. This thought is totally conditioned by the fact that it cannot recognize and does not want to recognize its own material dependence on the spectacular system. So again, I'll pause there for the, I mean, the idea is he's leading into these people who will be discussed in the next few sections here, academic sociologists, structuralists, various sort of academic theorists who are looking at the society in a semi-critical way, but they are failing to acknowledge, even to themselves, we depend on this society. I have a nice job here at the university, and my books sell well, and so I'm doing these things, but they're presented in a separate thing. And so I can say, oh, American society has all these weird things. It's a wasteful society. It's a society that has what he calls the spectacle, pseudo events are going on, all this. But they'll say that as if this is, oh, from our lofty position here, we don't have to criticize ourselves. We can just note that for some unforeseen reason, there are these strange flaws in our marvelous society. And we have the honesty and the intelligence, perceptibility to point them out. Hey, look at this. This is weird how the advertising industry works. This is weird how much people watch television or something. My goodness, let's look into that. So that's what he's leading into. But I'll pause here for a minute. Any comments? Particularly from people we haven't heard from before. Kirsty, do you have any comment or question? If you do, unmute yourself.
Right, so, okay. Yeah, no, I mean, this whole chapter is really fascinating, but there's a lot I could say about it. But I mean, it's interesting in kind of looking at, like, in earlier readings that he sort of referred to us as being in this sort of stasis here, and the spectacle, although it keeps changing, it's really like we're stuck, we're not moving. And that's sort of, thinking about both the, often commented history of art and of music, of in the West anyway, of going through this sort of centuries of, various styles and then various deconstruction into various other styles, and leading to Dada, surrealism, etc. And now we're just in this other period where, okay, well, we've done it, but it just keeps going anyway, right, for some reason. And it reminds me of, I mean, just on the terms of popular music, the way, like, when we were in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, we had sort of, you could easily identify a piece of pop or rock or whatever, R&B, of what period it came from. But people who are younger, I mean, now that everything is available all the time on the internet, that whole thing has been lost. And there's just kind of like a big mass of musical production that, in a way, people can pull from and make new things. But at the same time, it's kind of ground to a halt in a way. And that, yeah, on the sort of technology side, the kind of perpetual talk about let's disrupt things and create and move on and make new things. But we're at the same time in this kind of inability to move forward. So, yeah, and so it was interesting that his comments on the Baroque of, choosing life as opposed to eternity. And it was just it almost made me think about how all these sort of tech billionaire types like Peter Thiel and so on are so bent on finding a way to become immortal and live forever, and really sort of make that whole, rather than metaphorical, make it actual physical things of they will exist forever in this frozen technological moment we're in.
Yeah. Thank you. Kim, do you have any comments, questions?
Well, when we were talking earlier about art, I was thinking about, I always compare, if you're familiar with the Cycladic art, the Cyclades from ancient Greece, the islands where they they created these little figurines out of stone, and how those didn't change for centuries. They were pretty much the same, although they would change a little bit over a great period of time. And then comparing that to all the different artistic movements of the 20th century, one after another. It's got to be constant innovation. One movement is dispensed with, another movement replaces it. And I always thought, well, that's because of capitalism and technological innovation, and part of the system that we're forced to live in, as far as constant technological change, constant artistic movements and schools that are based in that system. So I just wanted to, that was a thought that occurred to me, because I have for years made this comparison between the slow, very slow change of Cycladic art, for example, and the constant change of modern art movements.
Yeah, thank you. Bruce, Ellen, do you have any comment or questions? Haven't heard from you.
Nothing really outstanding, but one thing that kind of been crossing my mind is the thought that there hasn't been anything comparable since the coming and going of the surrealist and then the Dadaist movement. No similar type of movement or no comparable movement, artistic movement, has happened since, and I don't know quite what to make of that.
Well, I think the Situationists themselves would say, without any modesty, we are the next thing there, but it's of the nature of things that we aren't an art movement. But when he says it's an avant-garde movement, but on the same time, it doesn't exist. It's kind of like saying we are the next thing there, but the next thing by its very nature couldn't be an art movement. So we're, after Dadaism and Surrealism, the only thing left was to really go beyond it, and we did that. So in a sense, you could say we're avant-garde artists in the sense that we're in that tradition, but in another sense, you can say we're not even artists at all, avant-garde or not. So I would just say that is one movement that has sort of moved in to say, hey, from here on out, the very notion of an avant-garde movement is very dubious at best. So
Then the question in my mind is what has there been since? I mean, the Situationists for like 50, 60 years ago.
right. Good question. And so that is our dilemma, because
there's been, in fact, it's more than 60 years. It's more than that. It really, I mean, 1968 was 56 years ago, and what has there been since?
yeah, in the way of art movements, to speak of, nothing. I mean, you have had movements, but would they be considered major?
Not really, not really movements that are transformative in nature.
That's what I'm saying. I mean, some people would say, well, punk was something blah blah blah, but you say, well, is that an art movement, or is it
but the guy who was I forget his name, who was linked to the Sex Pistols, I mean, he basically saw himself as identified himself with surrealism, so really that wasn't really much in the way of being any kind of break.
Actually, some of them focused on the Situationists. But I say that not to, like, I've never found that very interesting, but it's like at a certain point, you say, instead of an art movement, you say it's a lifestyle movement, like there's the hippies and then the punks and then whoever, whatever.
There's
So none of that
nothing.
is satisfactory exactly, but
No, it is.
just to say that the Situationists rightly said that art was dead, which might have seemed pretty hyperbolic, but in a way there's, I mean, of course, arts have gone on and on and on, but they're saying, by somebody like Debord is saying, there's nothing new here. You know, yeah, of course, people are grinding out variations of neo-Dadaism combined with Cubism, combined with, you know, blah, blah, blah. But that the same way that he talked about how the Dadaists and Surrealists were kind of left in the cold because the Spartacus revolution was defeated and things like that, we might say that, well, of course, there's no art movements very significant because the social, political, radical movements have been minimal. There have been a number of them, but you know, it's kind of scattered all over the place. I mean, so, but we could say, okay, there's something like the Occupy movement, which I think is pretty significant, but it had its limitations. And of course, it had nothing to do with art whatsoever. It was just, it was a movement that could have been akin or linked with stuff. And in fact, it did have some influence by the Situationists, this whole notion of participating. And
I can appreciate that you feel the Occupy movement was very significant, given that you were part of the Occupy movement in the Bay Area. But my experience with the Occupy movement where I was, I mean, it was nothing even remotely comparable. I mean, I was part of the formation and duration of Occupy in my own community, and it never was really a serious initiative, and it quickly dwindled, and it just became a talk shop that accomplished absolutely nothing.
okay, yeah, I understand. Gerhard, you've got your hand up.
Yes, Ken. While we've been doing this, I've been really looking for the parallels with the Provos of Holland and seeing that, like the Situationists, they came so much out of the art world. Many of them were, you know, modern painters or sculptors, and they sort of merged that with their political activism, which was remarkably successful for my part, to the extent that they got the change they wanted and then disbanded. But more currently, I think a lot about the Burning Man phenomena, which came out of an impulse that was pretty thoroughgoing and worldwide, so that you have burners without borders all over the globe, and various continents have their own version of Burning Man. And the ideas there were to decommodify, to decommercialize, you know, packaged commodified art, and to move towards something like radical inclusiveness and new ways of forming tribal associations, as for instance here on the West Coast, where the Greater Otter Camp runs all the way up through British Columbia up to Alaska. This is sort of a clannish kind of a meeting, and again, it's become a shadow of what it once was. And I don't go there, and I haven't gone for 10 years, but I still recognize the thoroughgoing experimental nature of creating a whole city in the desert, and various forms of it back in the city. You know, the coming out of the desert, that kind of thing.
Uh-huh.
These
Yeah,
are things that interest me to this day. It's going on.
right. No, there are definitely things going on. It's just to I think where Bruce is coming, it's that many of them would be considered, well, in the broader scheme of things, is this, you know, there's something going on there that maybe affects a certain number of people for a certain period or something. And it is kind of interesting. And then on the other hand, they almost predictably sort of fade out after a little bit. You know, they get too popular, or they lose their, you know, people get bored with them, or it becomes too tricky to deal with the logistics when they get big, or whatever. Ed, you've got your hand raised again.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to Kirsty's point, talking about the the spectacle continuing. It seems to be always there. In 192, there is the line where it says the function of the spectacle is to bury all historical memory. So the actual context in which art, for example, may have been created is now expunged, and the piece by itself lives as a commodity. So now you could be listening to the radio and hear Eve of Destruction and go, well, it's a cool song, not realizing it's about, Vietnam protest. But that context, that critical context, that reactionary context is gone, because immediately following it is a song by, I don't know, the Carpenters. So the reason why the song was created in the first place, its historical reason is gone. And so you get this general sameness across the board. You can now have people walk into, I guess, the Prado to see Guernica. And I'm sure somebody's thought, that would look lovely in my living room because it matches my couch, right? You can't do that. Guernica was created for a reason. Now, the final thing too, in 193, the comment that culture will become a driving force of the American economy absolutely is correct, because Debord mentions this in the comments on the spectacle, where he talks about the integrated spectacle and the Americanization of the world. So you have this hierarchical, top-down, unilateral conversation, and it really isn't. It's simply communication, where it moves in one direction from America to the world. So that general sameness, that general always already there, that's a strategic move on behalf of the spectacle. Remove the historical context and then send it out everywhere. So we lose track of why something was created in the first place.
Yeah. Thank you. Let's see. Well, do we have anyone else who hasn't spoken? Ivan or Bill?